Greece's entry into World War I, though easily overshadowed by America's entry around the same time, proved to be a key factor in how the Central Powers collapsed. As the Germans focused, with no success, on the Western Front, the Entente would manage to open up the Macedonian Front, leading to the collapse of Bulgaria, the first Central Power to fall. The Ottomans, already greatly struggling, surrendered next with the path to their capital open. A continued push into Serbia, threatening the Austrian Southern Front, would lead to its surrender and collapse. Now alone and on the retreat in the west, while being threatened by a new Southern Front opening, Germany too would have to surrender. The Great War was over. But the Greek entry into the war was far from guaranteed. In fact, it was nearly fully the design of Prime Minister Venizelos. He would struggle for years against King Constantine, who was pro-Central Powers and favored neutrality. The Greek entry into the war was actually an interesting story. After Germany achieved major successes against Russia, Bulgaria would join the war. This would finally allow the Central Powers to knock out Serbia. The fleeing Entente forces moved their way into northern Greece, where they would remain for the rest of the war, reinforced by other Entente forces. What followed was an internal power struggle between the pro-Entente Venizelos and the pro-neutrality king. When the king fired the prime minister, the liberals would declare a revolutionary Committee of National Defense in the north, a group led by Venizelos who would try to get Greece into the war. The situation was tense, as Greece was now essentially in a low-intensity civil war. Soon, Bulgarians would officially invade Greek territory, yet still, the king refused to condemn the Central Powers. This was too much. Large parts of the army flocked to Venizelos, who now declared a pro-Entente provisional government in the north. Even now though, the king would remain firm in his neutrality, while slowly, the Entente would entrench their position within the nation. By this point, the only thing keeping King Constantine in power at all was Tsar Nicholas, who refused to allow the Entente to simply remove the king to get Greece into the war. Luckily though, a revolution would remove the Tsar in early 1917. Now, King Constantine was forced by the Entente to abdicate, and Greece finally entered the war fully. So, with that background discussed, we're going to discuss two scenarios today. In the first, we're gonna have Greece enter the conflict by having the king ask for the Central Powers to aid him in dealing with what he considers to be a revolt. This is the more realistic of the two scenarios, since like mentioned before, King Constantine didn't really want to enter the war, instead hoping to remain neutral. But this version also sees Greece essentially in a civil war upon entering the conflict. So we will also run through a second timeline where around 1915, after Bulgaria joins the Central Powers and Serbia falls, Greece forcefully resists the entry of Entente forces into the nation, with the king therefore entering the war before Venizelos can consolidate the Entente in northern Greece. So let's first run through the first scenario. Venizelos sets up the Entente in the north and the king is outraged. The Entente have infringed on Greek sovereignty and the king declares his support for the Central Powers officially. Now you might expect this to turn the tide of the war, expulse the Entente from the Balkan and consolidate the region, though this is quite unlikely. The Greek standing army was barely 30,000 soldiers. Sure, more could and would be mobilized, but not before a full-scale civil war would rock the Greek nation, with generals and population picking sides. In our timeline, the stalemate around Macedonia and southern Albania lasted for about 3 years with little movement. For the Allies, the breakout of this Greek civil war, while it might lead to some setbacks in the region, isn't actually that terrible. The Allies would be swift in recognizing the opposition government, while a naval blockade would prevent resources and forces from reaching Greece. After months of brutal brother-on-brother warfare, most of Greece will fall under Entente control. There is a reason that in our timeline, both King Constantine and the German government wanted Greek neutrality, not Greek entry into the war. Militarily speaking, Greece had very little to offer the Central Powers. So, in this timeline, Greece has just become a rare front where the Entente are actually the ones on the offensive, and so it also gets further reinforcements. Still, militarily speaking, this scenario is far from interesting. Venizelos is put in charge of a temporary Greek government, with the fate of the kingdom uncertain. Aside from minor fighting on the Macedonian front, World War I is not fundamentally altered in this timeline. Russia is still driven to collapse, America still enters the conflict, and the combined weights of military defeats, hunger, and the ever-tightening Entente blockade will cause the Central Powers to be the ones to buckle under the pressure as the war comes to a close. But with the war now over, we need to ask a serious question. A peace deal has to be signed, but is Greece mostly counted as an Entente member due to the counter-government of Venizelos, or do the Entente hold a grudge and treat Greece as a Central Powers member due to the war declaration by King Constantine? Now personally, I consider it most likely that upon the collapse of royalist Greece, Alexander, son of King Constantine, takes the throne of Greece. Influenced by Venizelos and threats from the Entente, Greece is treated as an Entente nation. In such a scenario, Venizelos likely has quite a bit of pull with the Entente, allowing him to get similar, if not more concessions as to our timeline, gaining Smyrna in Turkey as well as major parts of Thrace. Now sadly for Venizelos, Mustafa Kemal will still manage to defeat the Greek forces. A Greece having suffered from 8 years of civil and world wars will reluctantly end up looking rather similar to the Greece of our timeline. But while I consider it more likely that Greece is treated as an Entente member, it is more interesting if they don't. Now, Greece would be open to being partitioned. While I don't expect radical things like Yugoslavia being able to claim all of Macedonia, which wouldn't be accepted by the Entente, Greece can still come out looking quite different. Yugoslavia might gain some border territories inhabited by Bulgars and Turks. The issue of Bulgarian Thrace is also interesting. Neither Bulgars nor Greece held a majority in the entire territory. It could very well be divided into plebiscite regions where, for example, Greece might gain the coast, where most Greeks live, but Bulgaria keeps most of it, allowing them to just barely have a coastline, while a portion could even go to Turkey if they are on the ballot. The Mediterranean islands then are interesting, as Italy and Britain may be interested. I doubt that major islands like Crete would be seized, but I could easily see Italy, who already got influence over Albania, receiving at least temporary control over some Greek islands, and perhaps even a little region of western Greece. When Italy falls to a dictatorship, these occupations might become far less temporary. I'm sorry for the quick intermission, but by far most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with all the latest releases, consider doing so. Thank you. Now, this timeline is more interesting going forward. Aside from the smaller Greece, Greece is not involved in the Turkish War for Independence. This makes Turkey's victory against the remaining Entente forces far easier, and leaves both Turkey and Greece in a better place after the war, not having thousands die during the conflict. Alternatively though, both countries have large minorities of the other, and without this war, there is no guarantee that they would do a population exchange like they did in our timeline. Now politically, Greece would be quite tumultuous here. Venizelos would be completely discredited. He stuck his neck out to join the Entente. He sacrificed Greek lives for the Entente cause, only for Greece to be treated as a defeated nation. In post-war Greece, King Constantine would be completely exonerated by the Greek population, his popularity only rising. The royal family, along with pro-neutrality figures like Metaxas, would take power in Greece. Now it is difficult to say if this would actually change Greece's position in World War II. Metaxas and the royalists were actually in power in our timeline, and they did try to keep Greece neutral, though Italy had different plans. We basically have two options for this alternate timeline. Either Greece, because of Italian ambitions, is still overrun by the Axis. As an allied power, Greece would manage to regain a bunch of their territories after the war, potentially including some concessions from Bulgaria. Modern Greece would be similar to ours, but far, far weaker. Now, alternatively, this alternate Greece could radicalize further against France, Britain and Turkey. Italy might decide to actually court the Greeks for an alliance in the lead up to World War II. This could turn out very interesting. Instead of invading Greece like in our timeline, Greece might join the Axis. Italy, in this alternate timeline, might even invade Turkey instead. Now this would be quite interesting, but also disastrous for the Axis. Italy would likely fail to take Constantinople until the Germans come to bail them out. But more interestingly, Greece and Italy may try to launch a naval invasion of Anatolia. With the competency of the Italian army though, I highly doubt that this would be successful. This alternate World War II would have Britain fight alongside Turkey, which would allow them, and later America, to get far more involved in the Eastern and Balkan fronts. This would likely also ruin any hopes for a German Caucasus campaign, as the Allies are very nearby and can assist the Soviets with air support, to protect the precious Soviet oil supply. The peace deal in such a scenario would be interesting. The Allies could have pushed far further into the Balkans, and while the larger peace deal is mostly similar to our timeline, the Allies might expand Turkey, and surprisingly, Greece too, while the fate of Bulgaria is uncertain and could go to either the Allies or the Soviets. Now before we conclude this video, the final thing I want to discuss is if the Greek king during World War I, after Bulgaria assisted in the destruction of Serbia, completely refused to accept any Entente forces into the nation, basically joining the war at this point. While completely unrealistic, it is very interesting. In the short term, this would be a pretty decent blow to the Entente. The evacuation of Serbian forces would be like the Dunkirk of this scenario, with Italy, France and Britain trying to get as many soldiers out as possible, likely relocating them to fight on the Italian front instead. The Balkan front is now secured for the Central Powers, and despite strong internal opposition to the Greek entry into the war, these revolts and strikes would be unsuccessful in the short term. So, does this redirect German forces to other front lines, with the additional strength causing the collapse of the Entente? Very unlikely. The Germans barely had 20,000 soldiers in the Balkan, which can now go elsewhere. On the other hand, around 700,000 Entente soldiers have been freed up to fight on other front lines. Now technically, there are hundreds of thousands of Bulgarian and Greek soldiers available for the Central Powers war effort. But this is not Hearts of Iron 4. 500,000 Bulgarians aren't suddenly going to jump on a train to fight on the Eastern Front against Russia. Of course, some might, but by far not all of them. Greece's small navy and weak army that is not going to commit to crazy adventures elsewhere is not changing the tides of the other fronts, and the Allied blockade of the Central Powers would be just as effective as in our timeline. Come 1918, with the Americans entering the conflict, and the strain and hunger of the blockade devastating the Central Powers, they would still collapse. Surprisingly, the minor army of Greece wasn't enough to swing the tides of the war. The conclusion to this timeline will mostly be the same as the Greek Central Powers scenario previously discussed, but with a major caveat. Venizelos could be regarded as a hero, while the king would be a villain. Towards the later period of the war, it is very possible that Venizelos, liberals and republicans coup and even depose the king, potentially ending the monarchy altogether. For now though, this is the end of the video. Thank you all for watching, and consider leaving a like and a comment as well as subscribing. If you've enjoyed this video, click on the video on top to watch another in this series. If you've already seen it, then I'm sure that the bottom video is great too. Once again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.